Did you know there is a theological history of abortion?
Are you Todd Friel?
Go and make disciples. What could possibly go wrong?
Give me a hug.
Hello and welcome to Wretched. My name is Todd Friel. I am your host. The wretch the song refers to. Abortion is not primarily a scientific argument, nor is it primarily a philosophical argument. Instead, abortion is theological, starting in the book of Genesis.
In chapter 3, there's the declaration of war between the serpent and the seed, and the promise that the way God is going to deal with man's sin problem is through the promised seed that comes through the woman. That's chapter 3. In chapter 4, we have the first murder. What is the first murder? The seed of the serpent, Cain, and I call him that because in 1 John chapter 3, John calls him that. The seed of the serpent, Cain, kills the seed of the woman, Abel. God declares war, and then Satan fires the first shot.
In other words, there is a theological history to the battle of life. Starting in the garden, God gave a promise to Adam and Eve, I'm going to send a seed. That was it. Little fuzzy, the entire Old Testament is the working out of that seed. More and more descriptors of who he was going to be, what he was going to accomplish specifically, ultimately revealed in Jesus. But in the meantime, devil didn't know the details. Humans didn't know the details, and so the devil went to war against the seed of the woman, and we see that battle throughout the Old Testament.
Abraham is promised a son. What's significant about that? That his wife is beyond seed-bearing years. God promises a seed. The next link in the chain appears to be broken because this woman cannot do what God says women are going to do to bring about the one who will end this curse. So what do? Do we go to Hagar and Ishmael? No, we don't. We wait for God to provide the promised seed, Isaac.
God gave a promise to the woman. There's going to be a seed who's going to crush the head of the serpent. More details when God promises Abraham, I am going to give to you a singular seed. Now the devil knows the ancestry of that seed. It will come from the loins of Abraham. The rest of the Old Testament, what do we see? A desperate attempt on the part of the devil to cut that line, to put an end to the lineage of the seed, so that there wouldn't be a Messiah who would crush his head.
Very next book in the Bible opens up with what? Pharaoh, seed of the serpent, who gives the order to kill male children born to the Hebrew women. The war between the serpent and the seed. And it goes on and on and on. We come to the New Testament, and amazingly, Matthew opens up with what? A genealogy. Why? To connect you to Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 4, so that you know that Jesus Christ is the promised seed. What happens next? Herod tries to do what Pharaoh tried to do. Why? The war between the serpent and the seed.
It is a theme in the Bible. The devil's desire to not let one be born who is going to conquer him. Hold on. You're thinking, well, that's the end of that tale. Herod trying to kill the children. Herod acting on behalf of the devil to put an end to this seed business. That is not where the battle for life ends.
All the way to Revelation chapter 12, where we see this picture of this dragon and this 7 heads and these 10 horns. And what happens? There's a woman who is about to give birth, and he is there to devour the child. The war between the serpent and the seed, from Genesis to Revelation. Folks, abortion is spiritual warfare.
And that is why when we engage an unregenerated world on the subject of life, it is not primarily scientific or philosophical in nature. It is theological, and that will drive our message.
Our message to the culture at large is that gospel message. And here's what we see. That Christ, through his incarnation, vindicates, validates, and verifies the sanctity of human life at every point, from conception to natural death. How? Folks, he could have come to this world in any way, shape, form, fashion he chose. But God chose conception and every step of the birth process, thus validating, verifying the sanctity of human life while it's in the womb, all the way to the end of life, where God the Son experiences death, thus validating and sanctifying even that part of our experience.
Got a question for you. When you discuss the issue of abortion with somebody who is not a believer, what is your message? Next on Wretched. This is not your average day at the beach. This is Bible League International at work, preaching the gospel, discipling the nations, and baptizing believers. Would you please support the work of Bible League International? $5 a Bible, perhaps 6 Bibles per month. Bible League International, wretched.org/Bible.
These millennial models clearly bought their suits at a 2-for-1 sale. Like most millennials, they are lost. Like so many millennials, they are not coping well. Like most millennials, they have never heard the true gospel. Help us reach millennials through their fancy technology. Support our millennial initiative so these models can hear the gospel, get saved, and dress better.
Welcome back to Wretched. Got a question for you. When you evangelize somebody, how much do you, keyword here, rely on your personal testimony? Make no mistake about it, ain't nothing wrong with a personal testimony, which should serve to support the veracity of the Bible and its claims, but we want to be very, very careful that we don't lean entirely or mostly on personal anecdote.
We are people of the book. Amen? Amen. We are people of the gospel. It is not about my personal story. My personal story has very little relevance. Why do I need to give you my story when I have his story that I can tell you? The gospel is actually his story, not mine. But we don't believe that. And that's part of the problem.
To be clear, don't feel bad if you've ever used your testimony in sharing the gospel. But the point that Voddie Baucham is making is that anecdote ultimately will not win a spiritual war. Why? Because you can share your anecdote, a Buddhist can share his, a Hindu hers, and what do you have? Nothing but competing stories. Please note again, it is not wrong to share a testimony, but we don't want to fall into the trap of waging spiritual war with story when we are in the context of evangelism or life.
We have fallen for a trap, and the trap is that this issue is all about personal stories, and that we have to have more compelling personal stories than the other side. And if we can just come up with compelling personal stories, then we can just win the argument. Ultimately, compelling personal stories usually come down to who's telling the personal story. And there are people with compelling personal stories on the other side. There are people who will talk about having had an abortion and having had their life basically rescued because they weren't saddled with a child, so to speak. So if all we're about is personal stories, then that becomes a problem.
Again, there is nothing wrong with a personal testimony of a woman and baby's lives who were rescued because of the message of life. That's not his point. The point is that we will not win a spiritual battle with personal anecdotes. As Voddie rightly said, because when does he speak wrongly? These days you can go on the internet and you're encouraged to share your wonderful story of having an abortion so we can celebrate an abortion. You were a woman, you couldn't get a job. If you had a baby, you would have to stay home and be strapped to that baby ball and chain. The life of the woman would have been miserable, but she was set free when the life of her child was taken. They will tell you as compelling, at least apparently, compelling a story as we can tell about the joys of motherhood. And we live in a culture now that is actually willing to admit, yeah, we know that it's the taking of the life of a human being, but it's our story that matters way more than his or her story.
I know it's a human life, and I don't care, because not all human life is equal. Basically, she's saying some human lives need to be sacrificed if they stand in the way of other human lives. Let me ask you something. Where's your personal anecdote for her? What do you say to her when she steals your thunder on the abortion stops a beating heart argument? What do you say to her when she stands there and says, yeah, you're right, I agree, and my position has not changed? What do we have then? That's why I believe it's important for us to have a biblical, theological understanding and approach to this issue and the way that we address this issue with our culture at large.
If our lead punch is a personal anecdote which are edifying to the saints and can be of interest to an unbeliever, but we set the terms, we build the ring in which we enter to go about the business of battling for life, and we will inevitably lose. If the ring that we have drawn is that of personal anecdote, we're going to come in, here's one story, and they're going to go, here's another story. And we're going to go, yeah, but what about this story? And they're going to go, well, take that story. And round and round and round we will go, especially when we live in an era when we can't say things like, yeah, but your story means the taking of a life. Their response is, well, maybe, but my personal anecdote trumps life. Where are we left then?
I'm not saying the compelling stories aren't important, they are. But if we're not careful, we think that what we're supposed to do is find the story that's the magical judo move that will melt the hardest of hearts so that we can win the argument because of our compelling story. What happens when somebody tells a more compelling story than the one we told?
We lose. So let us put our compelling stories in their proper place. Theology in its lead role, defining the terms, shaping the ring in which we do battle for life. There's another ring, however, we can draw that will ultimately lead to defeat, and that is the ring of, next, on Wretched.
Whether you're driving through a harsh blizzard, taking a road trip through the Pacific Northwest, or racing through the Sahara Desert, you could be listening to Wretched Radio. Do any of these images match what I'm saying? No. But then you wouldn't get to see this guy jumping rope on top of a building at sunset, or this woman running on a bridge over a river. Listen to Wretched Radio at wretched.org or on iTunes.
I was thinking about getting an abortion, and I ended up losing my job. So I had no money coming in. And when I came in and I heard the heartbeat for the first time, that changed everything. And that baby was supposed to be here for something, and that was all that mattered. So, to me, the ultrasound was the best part, because up until that point, I did not think about anything but myself. I did not think about the blessing that I was given and what was inside of me.
Welcome back to Wretched. Let me see if I can build my case via a plug. Preborn.org/wretched. These are pro-life ministry centers around the country that offer women free ultrasounds. That is science. Look what is inside of you. Clearly, it is a human being. They use science. But is that where Preborn stops? Not at all. Science can be a useful tool when it comes to the issue of life, and I think Preborn employs that beautifully. But Dan Steiner, who leads that ministry, he is fervent about something else even more than the rescuing of babies. I know that sounds shocking, but he wants to rescue mommies and daddies spiritually. Dan knows that the cycle of abortion will not stop unless mommies and daddies get saved. Then they will raise up their children in the fear and the admonition of the Lord, and the cycle of abortion will end, and eternity will be changed. That is the spiritual battle. The physical battle, it's important. Spiritual battle, far more so. So what do they do at preborn.org/wretched, where you can support that ministry? They preach the gospel. Having said that, let us return to Voddie Baucham and the comments that he made at a pro-life banquet. He's encouraging us that this is a spiritual war that we are engaged in when it comes to the issue of life, because we see the theme of life versus death, the killing of children, all throughout the entire Bible. That establishes for us that the issue of our day is not primarily a physical battle, but a spiritual battle. That, therefore, changes our tools, because our goal is different. Do we want to save human lives? Of course we do. That is a given. But even more, we want to change spiritual life. So how does that get accomplished? Remember, the field on which we engage is spiritual. That doesn't mean that we can never have a debate merely in the realm of the physical, but if the ring that we enter into as believers to discuss the life issue is to discuss the sanctity of life, because it actually is a human life, not just a clump of cells. That's good. We do that. Our Life is Best DVD does that in part. That's good, because you might change the mind of somebody who thinks that abortion is really, really nifty. But that is not the primary ring of the believer. Our calling, and we are the only ones who can engage in this battle with the world, are those of us who have been redeemed from the world. And so we engage with different tools. Let me see if I can build my case. Would challenge you to do this. Please, if you can, set aside some time to read 1 Corinthians 1, 2, and 3. This will be life-changing when it comes to engaging the world in conversations about virtually anything. For instance, can you talk to the world about philosophical issues? If you'd like to, and those debates can be, I guess, somewhat fruitful, but what does it profit an audience who is persuaded by a Christian philosophical argument, but they leave the venue, they die on the way home, and go to hell? We are to engage on a different level. As you read through 1 Corinthians 1, 2, and 3, you are going to see that all throughout the context of those 3 chapters. Even when Paul appears to take a little bit of a hiatus from the subject of wisdom, it's in the context of the gospel. Hey, this is what this thing is all about here. We want people to know about Jesus Christ dying for sinners, crushing the head of the serpent, removing guilt and shame and offering everlasting life. And therefore we preach the foolishness of the gospel. The world hears our terms, they hear the gospel, and they think it's absolutely dopey. The Bible they think it's foolish. Absolute foolishness. And you know what God thinks of worldly wisdom? It's foolish. So who wins that debate? Clearly, it is the Lord. Why? Because He's the one who determines what is wise and what is foolish, because He is wisdom itself. And therefore, when He looks at the wisdom of the world, He calls it absolute foolishness. And He says to the Christian, don't engage on that foolish level. Instead, do what Paul did. Preach nothing but Christ and Him crucified. And you think, well, he could maybe get away with that in his day, because after all, those people, they weren't as clever as the erudite, educated intelligentsia of our day. They were plenty smart then. We had Greek philosophers in Athens. They used to just sit around and jawbone about nothing but philosophy and worldly wisdom. And so they were intrigued by Paul and went, let's hear your little philosophy. And what does he preach in Acts chapter 17? Zilch about philosophy. Instead, he dives right into the preaching of the gospel. Let me just randomly grab one section. This is 1 Corinthians 16. Christ, the power and wisdom of God. You want people's thinking to be better? They need God wisdom. And so it tells us, for the message of the cross, it's foolishness to those who are perishing. But we preach it because God is going to destroy the wisdom of the wise. He's going to confound the brilliant scholars of our day by demonstrating to them this foolish message that you're a sinner who cannot save yourself. It is only accomplished by God, and you need to humble yourself like a little child. Tush, tush. This childish sort of argumentation. And Paul reiterates over and over and over again, that is our message. Why? Because these things are spiritual in nature. We can use science. Yep, you can use logic and reason to a degree to demonstrate that what is inside of a woman's womb, it's clearly a baby. And that has its place, but we want to win souls. So for instance, consider avoid worldly wisdom. This is now chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians. Let no one deceive you. If you want to be wise, you seem to be wise, let him become a fool, that you may become wise. On and on and on it goes. Let us engage the world, and we will carefully. I got it. Got the illustration. You've got a drawer full of cutlery, and if you want to take a spoon to ladle just a little bit of philosophy, you want to use a butter knife to use a little bit of science with them to show the science of embryology, that's really good. But if you want to cut deep into the marrow and into the joints and into the separating of all things for people so that they can understand themselves in truth, so that you can apply the Word of God and slice and slice and slice and cut and cut and cut to apply the gospel bomb, then take out the butcher knife of God's Word. That is where the battle is, and that is the battle that we Christians are called to fight. Anything less, child's play. Surprise, next on Wretched. Not many ministries are endeavoring to reach the youth of Eastern Europe, but Tomorrow Clubs are, and it is making a massive difference. Kids are being loved on, they are hearing the gospel, and they are grateful. Would you please support your own Tomorrow Club? $30 a month for 30 disciples at tomorrowclubs.org/wretched. May I please invite you to do two things at wretched.org. Please consider giving away the gospel. This is where the spiritual battle is raging. This little gospel booklet, it's a beauty too, filled with illustrations. Very, very nice. We'll give it to you up to 50 copies, or frankly, as many as you want if you fill out the right paperwork. We'll even send them to you so that you can give away the gospel. Wretched.org/purple. Whilst you're at the website, the only way that we can do things like this to get the gospel out there is through the support of our gospel partners. If you have benefited from the program, would like to support this mission, we could use you as a gospel partner. Wretched.org/donate. Welcome back to a Wretched Surprise. Imagine you are a paramedic, your phone rings. Hello? Ooh, somebody's life is in danger. I'll be right, because this is how they actually take those 911 calls. I'll be right there. You, the paramedic, skedaddle to somebody's home. You are received at the door, and a woman tells you, please come in my house. It is such a mess. Would you please help clean it? You take out your paramedic feather duster, step over the body of her husband who's flopping on the floor, and you go about the business of feather dusting the dust. Are you doing a nice thing? Sure. Is it important? Yeah. But is it the thing that you are called to do? No.
I love it when Paul goes to Corinth. We read there in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, when I came to you, I determined to know nothing among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. He goes on later in verse 5 to explain himself. Why? So that your faith might not rest on man's wisdom, but on God's power. We preach Christ and him crucified. That's what we preach. We have a biblical, theological understanding of the sanctity of life. That's what we preach.
We are Christians on a rescue mission, not merely for physical life, but for spiritual lives. Let us not be distracted entirely with the lesser thing. And let's see who won something, shall we? Congrats to Gary Longo. He just won something from the Wretched store. If you'd like to win, visit wretched.org and subscribe to the free Wretched newsletter. And until tomorrow, go serve your king.
Thank you for tuning into Wretched, and thank you for your generous support. Your tax-deductible gift allows us to preach the amazing gospel.